exemplar em vários sentidos. Patologista com grande capacidade diagnóstica, professor de brilhante didática e precursor no uso de metodologias ativas de ensino e na ênfase na transmissão dos conhecimentos sobre os dados e a memorização. Cientista de grande visão, ampla e perguntas muito bem elaboradas e relevantes. Todas estas características reunidas numa só pessoa e exercitadas com muita dedicação e virtuosismo já bastariam para torná-lo merecedor das nossas maiores homenagens e saudades. Lembramos também como mais uma evidência da enorme visão de futuro que possuía, da contribuição do professor para a comunicação social da ciência, articulista que foi de jornais em Salvador. Ele teve uma coluna durante muitos anos no Jornal à Tarde, né? E ele publicou um livro e depois nós estamos pensando em reeditá-lo. Não bastasse tudo isto, o professor Zilton foi mais além. Serviu de referência e estímulo para que mais de uma geração de jovens médicos trilhassem os caminhos da investigação científica. Criar e liderar uma escola médico-científica que se espraia para além da especialidade médica do seu líder é para poucos. É para os verdadeiros iluminados. Ao render as últimas homenagens ao professor Zilton Andrade, devemos renovar os nossos votos de perseguir a excelência científica e maximizar a contribuição social da ciência, ainda que não nos alcance tamanho talento e arte. Salvador, 22 de julho de 2020, Manuel Barral Neto. Então, é com essas palavras, né, do Dr. Manuel Barral Neto que realmente nós rendemos no IGM essa homenagem ao Dr. Zilton Andrade. Nesta semana faremos uma sessão posteriormente, mas eu gostaria de registrar essa perda muito grande que tivemos no IGM, na Bahia, no Brasil e no mundo. Muito obrigada, Claudinha, pelo espaço.
Obrigada, Marilda. Realmente foi uma perda que abalou a todos nós. Mas, enfim, vamos continuar, então, com a nossa sessão científica. Bom dia a todos e a todas. Doutora Carolina Barrilas, ela é do NIH, então eu vou fazer a introdução em inglês. It's a pleasure to introduce Carolina Barrilas. She already visited us a couple of years ago, and I am very glad because she is a great scientist and a lovely friend. Carolina Barrilas Murry is the Chief of Mosquito Immunity and Vector Competence Section at NIAID. Dr. Barrilas received her BS in Biology from the Universidad del Valle de Guatemala, her MED from Universidad Francisco Marroquín de Guatemala, and her PhD in Biochemistry from the University of Arizona. She did postdoctoral training at the University of Arizona, and then she went to Harvard University and the European Molecular Lab. She was an assistant professor in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Pathology at Colorado State University. That is the time that I met Carolina. And she joined the Laboratory of Malaria and Vector Research in 2003 and became a senior investigator in 2010. Carolina also participated in the Science Without Borders of CNPq, working with Paulo Pimenta and Bcg in Belo Horizonte at the Fiocruz, Instituto René Rachou. So, Carolina, again, it's a real pleasure for us to receive you in our seminars.
Thank you. Good morning. I would like to start by thanking Claudia for this invitation. It is always a pleasure to be close to Brazil. Unfortunately, now at this moment it has to be virtual, but I have always felt very close, and I have had wonderful interactions with many researchers in Brazil. So some of you may know me. For many years, I have been studying the immunity, innate immune responses in mosquitoes. But in light of the pandemic, I decided to embark in this project. And one of the most intriguing and also devastating aspects of COVID is that it produces a broad range of symptoms, all the way from asymptomatic infections to lethality. And we know that there are many factors that can affect the outcome, such as age, gender, predisposing conditions such as diabetes or heart disease. But the question we're going to try to answer here is the immunological history of a person also a major determinant of the outcome? And is there anything we can do to change the outcome of disease until we can obtain a COVID-specific vaccine? So what I would like to, the question we decided to address is, are countries that have strong BCG vaccination policies, do they have less mortality than those that do not? So this is going to be a epidemiological analysis at a broad scale. And I will tell you first some background. What is the BCG? Why a vaccine against tuberculosis has the potential to protect from COVID-19? What is the biology behind it? Then I will discuss the epidemiological evidence that we have. And at the last part of the talk, I would like to give you like a broad perspective of where we are in Brazil, how do these pandemics expand? And then I think the most important part will be to have questions and discussion to see is there anything we can do to reduce the mortality and the severity of this disease, or should we just accept that many people will get infected and have long-term damage in their lungs or brain damage? So that will be the question at the end. So let's get started. So let me see here. So the BCG vaccine is a live organism vaccine. It consists of attenuated Mycobacterium bovis, and it is used extensively in national vaccination programs because it confers cross-protection from Mycobacterium tuberculosis infection. It's given to newborns and infants because this is the most effective age group, and this prevents disseminated tuberculosis in childhood. It gives partial protection also to tuberculosis in the lung, but that effect is not as strong as the protection from severe disseminated infection in childhood. There is ample epidemiological evidence that BCG vaccination has broad unspecific effects on other infections. And I will give you just a sample of a few of these cases. As early as 1927, when Swedish children who received the BCG at birth, it was noted that the mortality rate was almost threefold lower than unvaccinated children. And this decrease in mortality could not be explained by tuberculosis. So this was the first time that a Swedish doctor proposed that BCG, besides having the effect on TB, also was having an unspecific effect, enhancing the immune response of the lung to, in a broad sense, and to other infections. Later in West Africa, there's a study in which BCG vaccination scar and a positive tuberculin reaction test was associated with better survival during early childhood, and this was not observed with other childhood vaccines. So there appears to be something special about BCG. In Guinea-Bissau, infants with acute infections of the lower respiratory tract were more likely to not have received BCG than matched control. So those children that were not vaccinated were more likely to have acute viral infections. And in Spain, the hospitalizations due to respiratory infections in children 0 to 14 years of age that could not be attributed to TB were significantly lower in BCG vaccinated children compared to the non-vaccinated group. So all of these, and there's more literature, all of these points to this unspecific effect. So how could BCG protect from COVID-19 viral infection or from any other viral infection? And then I think that this is a new area of research, and it's been called trained immunity. I think that the term can be a little bit confusing. I think I like to call it enhanced immune surveillance, because I think this gives us an idea that it's a broad phenomena that is not pathogen specific. So it's not cellular immunity and it's not antibody production, it's an innate immune response. So it's how the surveillance system of the immune system, the first encounter with the pathogen and how this pathogen is dealt with. So the term trained immunity is defined as an enhancement in innate immune responses to subsequent infections. And this is achieved through epigenetic and metabolic programming of immune cells, and it allows them to mount a stronger response to pathogens and to activate adaptive responses more efficiently. So, for example, here, these are some of the cells of the innate immune system, the cells that are, I would say, the guardians of the tissues. In the lung, we have cells that are there waiting, and they're sentinel cells that are surveying the environment. And if they encounter something, they are the ones that have to do two very important things. They have to recognize that there is a pathogen, and they need to know what kind of pathogen is this, because they are going to produce the first wave of chemokines and cytokines to call the rest of the adaptive immune system and guide the immune response to the appropriate type of response. Is it going to be cellular immunity or antibody production? This is defined early on. So if we see in this line here, we have the strength of the immune response in the y-axis, and the x-axis we have time. So we have the first challenge, we have this type of response, things go back to basal levels, and upon a second challenge, then you get a much stronger response. Now, this is an evolutionarily ancient system, and this is exactly what we described a few years ago for mosquitoes, when we demonstrated that although insects do not have adaptive immunity, they do have priming or trained immunity, and they can learn to respond better to subsequent infections. And we have been working on the molecular mechanism of how this is achieved in insects for a long time. Very little is known on how this is achieved and maintained in humans. Then, so trained immunity can confer broad protection, and I want to emphasize it is not pathogen specific. For example, the BCG vaccination is approved as a treatment for cancer of the bladder, and destruction of the cancer cells has been shown to be mediated by trained immunity. So if we make a comparison here, the clearest explanation I could give is, imagine that you have a business and you have two security guards in the business, and one day there's a thief that comes in and robs the place. So what are you going to do after you've had a robbery in the business? You will do two things. You will hire more security. Instead of having 2 people, you may have 4 or 6, and then you will send everybody to training, because you will see how the breach was done, and next time you're going to do better because you're going to be better prepared to respond. Now, this preparation is not thief specific, because you don't know who is going to be the next thief. So the surveillance system has to be broad and has to be ready for any kind of pathogen that may come. Now, as the pandemic started, right, I started looking at these maps. These are taken from the New York Times. This is the dates, and I noticed something that I found very intriguing. If you see, this is the number of cases of COVID cases from April 7th. You see in the United States how many cases there were, and look at Brazil, South America, right? And then if you look at Eastern and Western Europe, you see how many cases there were in Western Europe, and look at Eastern Europe. That caught my attention, because I mean, I would have thought that, you know, these are the wealthiest countries, seem to be having many more cases. And I thought, well, I didn't know what to think of that. Also, I was very concerned about South America, particularly Brazil, because they had the carnival and a lot of Europeans came into Brazil. And I thought, oh my God, this is going to be an explosion of cases. But so this was intriguing. And then I started thinking, you know, at the same time as I was looking at this, some of the people working with trained immunity started to propose that maybe this broad enhanced immune surveillance or trained immunity could be useful in COVID. Could one vaccinate adults with BCG, and would that give them a better surveillance so that if they get infected with COVID, they could respond better? So I decided to go and see, okay, do we have any data that supports this idea? Because I knew that some countries had different policies at the country level on BCG vaccination. And this is what we can see here. So I went ahead and I checked the maps. And this is what you see. This is a little bit outdated, but just to get the idea, in yellow, you have the countries that have BCG vaccination programs and have maintained them for many years and they're active. We have in orange those that have never had BCG vaccination programs. And then you have the purple blue, that those are countries that had a program, but they stopped. And if you can see, those are the countries that I showed you a minute ago that had a lot of cases of BCG, of COVID. So we started thinking, okay, how can we ask this question? And the problem is when you have such a broad analysis at a, worldwide level, how are you going to adjust all the variables that could bias your results? So at this point, we decided to form a team, and we formed a team of 3 people. I called Dr. Luis Escobar. He is an epidemiologist from Virginia Tech who has the expertise and in statistical analysis and to analyze what are the confounding factors that could give us a broad bias in the data that had to be corrected for. Also, Alvaro Molina Cruz is from NIH. He has done a lot of population studies, so he's also used to dealing with this large-scale analysis. Normally, I am a very lab-centric person, and I dissect little mosquitoes and look inside the mosquito, but now I have to zoom out and look at the whole world. So we form a team, and one of the first decisions we had to take is how are we going to measure these? And we decided that most likely, if this is a broad protection, it's not going to keep the person completely from getting infected with COVID, but most likely it will give a milder infection. So we decided to that maybe you're looking at mortality data will be better. And the other problem of using prevalence is that this is can be manipulated politically. And I will go back to this. I'll show you some data at the end and where Brazil lies in terms of testing. Because one strategy to look better is to stop testing. So then you show that there's less cases, and this is becomes very political and can also bias the results. So we decided to go for mortality. And of course, the mortality had to be adjusted for the number of citizens in a given country. So we started doing this kind of analysis. And so let me show you here the deaths per million, right? So these are a number of deaths, and they're corrected per million of people. And you see that the countries with a high human development index, and what do I mean by this? This is a measurement of well-being that takes into consideration how long the persons live in a given country, how educated they are, and what kind of standard of living they have. So if you can see here, this graph shows the correlation between human development index and deaths per million. So this first observation that I had, that the richer countries had more mortality, is confirmed here. And this is highly significant. The p-value is 3 × 10⁻42. So there is a very strong correlation there. And here you can see in the map, the dark orange, the darker the orange, the more mortality. And you can see that the dark orange places correspond to the countries that have not had or suspended their vaccination program. So from these, we conclude that COVID mortality is higher in countries with high human development index. But is this the only variable, or what other variables do we need to take into account? And to look at that, we did first it's a very complex, I'm just going to summarize it here, a multivariate model. So we put all kinds of, many different variables here, for example, population density, percent of the population that lives in urban area, the human development index, the age, 65% of the population more than 65. And then here in the last 3 rows is different measurements of BCG. And I'll go back to this Bcg Index. And what this table tells us is that if you know nothing about a country and you only had the information about human development index and population density, those are the 2 variables that best predict the mortality of COVID that a country has without knowing anything else. And the R-square is 0.45. Okay, but so this tells us that these are 2 variables that we really need to control for when we compare countries, or consider them when we compare countries. Now, if these variables, after these variables, the Bcg index is the next one, that will give you a predictive value. So one thing that you can do, and I'm going to refer to this later during the talk, is that you could compare socially similar countries. So one way to deal and eliminate these demographic differences that can change the data is that you can put a filter. And one of the filters that we use to call socially similar countries is that they should have more than 50% of the population 65 or older, 60% of the population living in urban areas, less than 300 inhabitants per square kilometer, and a human development index more than 0.7. So by putting all of these, then we can compare countries that are socially similar, and this will come back later in the talk. Now, another reason why countries that are richer or more developed have more COVID, one can imagine, is because people in those countries may be traveling more. So the pandemic could have arrived sooner in these countries, and timing is going to be important. So during my talk, you will see how we manage to try to normalize the correct for the time of arrival of the pandemic in different countries, and this is also very important. So this is the same, a similar map to what I showed, but this one shows the current, this is updated, the BCG vaccination. And again, in dark blue, we have the countries that have ongoing or current programs. Then the light blue are the interrupted ones, and the yellow is never. So when you look at this, this is the same graph I showed you, the same as the red graph I showed you, but here we have changed the colors, and in the color of the circles tells us whether the program is current, interrupted, or has never been implemented. And what you can see here, right, is that the countries that have the highest human development index are the ones that have interrupted or never established a program. And this makes sense because these developed countries have eradicated tuberculosis, and because tuberculosis has been eradicated, these programs have stopped because they're not economically feasible if the disease is no longer there. Now the question is, when they stop vaccinating, could they have lost an important broad enhancement of immunity that the vaccine was also having? And maybe this vaccine was also having a broad protective effect that these countries have lost. So first we did a broad analysis, and this is just taking the countries, and we have those that have current vaccination, interrupted, or never. And we found that these two, both the interrupted and never, have significantly higher mortality than the current, those with a current or active program. Now, this is all the countries together, but then we applied filters, and we only included then socially similar countries. Of course, this reduces greatly the number of countries, but if you take these countries and you compare them again, you still find a significant difference with countries that have a current program having lower mortality than those that have stopped the program or never had one. Now, this is a broad analysis, and we're going to go back to this kind of analysis and BCG policy much more refined at the end of this talk. Okay, so then we decided, okay, what kind of comparisons can we do? So one of them we decided to do was, okay, what happened when the pandemic arrived to the American continent? And I show this map to tell you that when this started in April, we are used to seeing the data per country, but really the data per country don't reflect what is going on, because the pandemic arrived into the New World, and that's the same for Brazil and all Latin America, by plane. So the focus or the points, epicenters of this entry into the American continent are large cities that have airports with a lot of air traffic. For instance, here we have New York, Atlanta in Georgia, New Orleans, Chicago, right? So we decided that instead of analyzing the data at the country level, we will analyze at the state level, taking into consideration the main states that have in the US, in Mexico and Brazil, that have large cities and that we know where the points of entry of the pandemic. And then we could make some comparisons there. Now, for this, of course, timing is critical. So what we did to normalize for timing is that we ask from the day in which the first death was reported in each country from COVID, right, was reported in each country, how many people die in the next 25 days? So this is the number of deaths, increasing number of deaths per day per country. And we have in in pink, and the countries that have no BCG, and then in blue, the ones that do have BCG, and here, the ones that are pink are different states in the US, and these are all states that had at least 20,000 cases, so we knew the pandemic had arrived there. And then we have the cases in Brazil, in the state of Pernambuco, Sao Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro. And then here, at day 25, where these dots are in the graph, corresponds to these numbers. And I want to show you these. These are the non-vaccinated. You see the deaths per million. And then you see in South America, although we have very high densities of populations, and I show them here on the left side, you can see that the population density is high in New York, 159, but in Mexico State, and including Mexico City or Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, the densities are even higher. And in spite of the poverty and the very high density, the first month of the pandemic was much milder in Latin America than it was in Brazil. And these are countries that have strong BCG vaccination programs. So this says that something different happened when the pandemic arrived in the New World. And these are, again, deaths, right? Deaths. And again, we use deaths because this is harder to manipulate. If you have 50,000 deaths, you cannot hide them. It's very difficult to hide them. The cases, you just stop testing and then the numbers look better. We also decided to compare East and West Germany. And this is an interesting country because they were separated until 30 years ago, before the unification, and they had different vaccination programs. And according to what we could find in the historical data, in the web-based information systems, the vaccination in Eastern Germany started a lot sooner, so that the older segment of their population is vaccinated. And then we ask, is there a difference in mortality? And we find that states of Germany that are on the east have significantly lower mortality than those on the west side. And again, these are corrected per million, deaths per million. So at an average overall, the average mortality rate in Western Germany is 2.94 times higher than in Eastern states. Now, if we look at Eastern versus Western Europe in a broader sense, and I'm zooming in because in the other map, Europe looked very small worldwide, but here we zoom in, again, look at the countries. The darker the red, the yellow or orange, the more deaths there are. And you can see that there are big differences. And that's on the left side. On the right side, you have the BCG policy. And you see that the countries that have this dark blue on the right are the ones that look light yellow on the left, right? And this is because these are the former Soviet Union countries, and they had very strong vaccination because tuberculosis has been endemic in these countries, and they still have very strong vaccination, BCG vaccination programs. We have in the other extreme, Italy, in the Netherlands and Belgium that have never had vaccination programs, and they had very severe COVID. Spain had a short-lived program, and France and the United Kingdom had programs, but they did not give it to infants, but they apply it later in school-age children. And so this also could have changed the outcome. So the mean mortality for COVID in Western Europe is 9.9 times higher than in Eastern Europe. And in Eastern Europe, these are countries that in general have strong BCG vaccination programs. But could we look at this in more detail? And to do that, we needed to create a number that could give us a summary of how strong is a vaccination program in a country. And there's several variables that you have to consider. Okay, when did the program start? How old are the people that are vaccinated? And we presume that having the older people vaccinated may be important because they are the ones at higher risk of severe COVID. The other one is how many years have they been vaccinated? 20 years, 30 years, 40 years? There's a broad range of time of vaccination. And of course, the third one is when the vaccination program was in place, how good was the coverage? Did they vaccinate 90% of the population, 95, or 20%? So we decided to put all of these together and create an index. And we call it the Bcg Index. So this number is calculated the following way. We have the age of the older vaccinated cohort, the years of universal vaccination, and is divided by this number, and this number represents the maximum or our winner, which is countries that have 75 years of uninterrupted vaccination and are still vaccinating. So this is 75 times 75 gives you this number, and then the vaccine coverage. So if you do that, then you create an index that goes between 0 and 1. And then we took all the data from, these are countries that had, of the ones that had vaccination, we only took countries that had infant vaccination through the intradermal route because we did not want to introduce more variants. So when you do that, you find a strong correlation. But then at this point, we're putting all the countries in Eastern and Western Europe without, and we're looking at the deaths per million in a given day. So we decided that we could also refine this data, and we did two things to refine the data. One is we put the social filters that I talked about to only compare countries that within Eastern and Western Europe that are socially similar. And the second one is we normalize the arrival of the pandemic in each country. In Europe, it arrived almost at the same time, but to be more precise, we just consider the deaths during the first month of the pandemic. And when we do that, we're surprised to find this. So we found a very strong linear correlation with the deaths per million, between the deaths per million and the Bcg index. The R-square is 0.88. This, we were surprised. If all the dots were right on top of the blue line, the R-square would be 1, but that is impossible at a population level. But this is 0.88. This is extremely high. And the probability that this is random is 1 in 80 million. So the correlation is very strong. And what we find is that every 10% increase in Bcg index is associated with a 10% reduction in the overall COVID mortality. And this is within European countries, socially similar in the first month of the pandemic. So again, just to emphasize that there is a very strong negative correlation, and every 10% increase in the Bcg index results in 10.4% reduction in COVID mortality. So what are the conclusions that we have from our epidemiological analysis? The results support the hypothesis of an association between Bcg vaccination and COVID mortality that suggests that Bcg could have a protective effect from severe COVID. Bcg vaccination trials and animal studies are necessary to corroborate the patterns that we detected here and to establish causality. Basically, if we take adults and we vaccinate them with Bcg, can we protect them from severe COVID? And these studies are underway in the Netherlands and in Australia. The problem I see is I think they're going to have to stop these studies because transmission has stopped in these two countries. And these studies of protection can only be done in areas of high transmission. The implications. Is this useful? Is this information useful? We think that considering the remarkable dissemination capacity and the mortality rates of COVID in the susceptible groups, a vaccination capable of conferring even tracing protection 6 months to a year may be useful as a bridge vaccine in high-risk individuals until we can have a COVID-specific vaccine. The other one is that if BCG is conferring some basal level of protection, it is possible that some of the social distancing, the rollback strategies that were used to reopen countries in Asia to restart the economies may not be effective in the United States and Europe. And we wrote this in April, and you can see what has happened. I'll show you some data what has happened in the US in June when economies were open and they were open prematurely. We have now a second wave of infections that is worse than the first one. So the basal level of susceptibility because of immune history in different countries may dictate very different results when you try to reopen these countries. So I think that the idea that a single vaccination during infancy could have such drastic effects that are measured at this scale is remarkable. Of course, it needs to be confirmed, but if this is true, I think it has enormous implications. One, we could have a vaccine that would allow us to have a pandemic, but with very low mortality and decreasing tremendously the hospitalization rates if this works. And from a biological perspective, it's remarkable that a single vaccination in infancy could train the immune system and leave it working in a different state of enhanced immune surveillance that could be protective for several decades after the vaccination takes place. And of course, if this is true, one has to question if it's a good idea to stop the BCG vaccination programs in light of other possible pandemics, usually viral infections of the respiratory tract that may come in the future. I think it also tells us that there might be a whole new class of vaccines that can be broad immune enhancers, and BCG may not be the optimal vaccine, but gives us an idea that such a vaccine may be possible. I think it's going to be a fascinating area in the next years. So here I would like to switch a little bit and just give you an update and just to tell you a little bit of the kind of problems there are when you're trying to analyze data at a country level. This is data in this table that I obtained from the World Meteor. This is a popular website to get data, and this is from July 11th. So here we have 5 columns, and the first 3 I took directly from them, and this is the total cases per million, the deaths per million, and then the number of tests per million. So something that one would like to, if you want to see how there's different, how severe or how well a person, or how well, if a person gets infected, how well do they do? You would like to see the mortality, and the mortality, the calculation is simple, is the number of how many people die of those that were infected. This will be here. Now, the problem with that is that this number, the total number of cases we talked about, can be manipulated because the level of testing varies a lot between countries. But there is a way to have an idea of how well the countries are testing, and that is you divide the number of cases detected by the number of tests done. So that will tell you the % positive tests. In general, what I have been told by some colleagues is that about 5% of positive tests tells you that you're doing a decent surveillance of the situation. So let's focus now. Just to clarify here, the total number of cases and the number of deaths, this depends on how well the pandemic is controlled. And this is determined by history, social density, and management from at the government level. However, the mortality is reflecting more the biology. If you were to be infected, how would you do? So they're telling us different things. So if we look at the yellow area, this is Asia, and you can see first that the numbers in the % positive tests are very low, in many cases way below 5%. Korea has 0.96, that means they did excellent surveillance. Countries that do very good surveillance can track the cases, and they were able to control the pandemic in general. And the mortalities in these countries are around 4-5%, varies a little bit. There's some phenomena that I'm not going to mention here, but I don't have data here, but it's found that in some countries like Thailand and Cambodia, they're seeing almost no COVID cases. They think there's something there that protects people, and they basically don't see cases. And this is very intriguing. I think nobody understands precisely why that is the case. Now, if we take Europe, first, let's look at the % positive test. If you see the last column, most of them are 5% or less, except for Sweden and France, who were a little short on testing. But if you see the mortalities, they're very high, 15, 9, 17%, right? These in yellow are countries that either did not have a BCG vaccination program, or that did not vaccinate infants. They vaccinated later on. So in the UK and France, they've had extensive vaccination, but older children. So this suggests that if you vaccinate older, this effect may not last as long. There's one potential explanation for this difference. Then in green, we have the countries that have the infant vaccination programs, and at different levels. This is the data that I show you with the mortality in the first month before, and you can see that in general, they have lower mortality. And then you have the Eastern countries that have also low levels of mortality. And again, they have strong vaccination programs. And this, you see that they're doing a reasonable job in terms of surveillance with the number of cases. Now, where is Brazil in relation to all these countries? And this is South America, and we have Brazil on top. So you see that Brazil has a high number of cases per million, and Brazil is a large country, so it has many cases. This is the mortality. But if you look at the mortality rate, it's relatively low compared to Europe. And this number is much lower because if you see the percent positive test, Brazil has 40% of test positive. That means that they are underestimated tremendously the number of infected cases. I would say that, in my opinion, at least the rate of infection is 8 to 10 times higher than what is being measured in Brazil. And that would mean that the mortality really is below 1%. That's true for other countries in Latin America. You can see the percentage of positive tests is very high, with some exceptions. Paraguay and Uruguay did a lot of testing early on. They contained the pandemic. And of course, the total number of deaths is very low because, I mean, the best way not to die of COVID is not to get infected with COVID, right? If this could have been stopped. But these are smaller countries that can put, that can contain, and that they did very good measures to control the infection. And then here's North America and the Caribbean. In the US, the mortality is low, but I think it's because we had an explosion of new cases in the last 3 weeks. We almost doubled the number of cases. And the deaths are just starting to catch up because the deaths happen about 3 to 4 weeks after the new cases appear. So I think the final mortality in the US may be something around 6 to 8% based on these numbers. Mexico, I will not mention much because I think there's consensus that Mexico is not reporting accurately. Now, Canada has 8% mortality. Then you see Central America. Again, we have very high number of positive cases. So again, I think the mortalities are going to be 1% or less. We have this is the Caribbean. And here, I just want to finish with an interesting observation about the Caribbean. You can see that some places like Dominican Republic did not contain the infection. They had a lot of cases, but the mortality is about 2%, even though the testing is a little bit low. Now, Cuba, Jamaica, and the Bahamas, they were able to contain the infection. They have very few cases. But look at the mortalities here. You can see that these three are low, and these are countries that have strong BCG vaccination. The Bahamas is an ex-British colony, and San Martin is an ex-Dutch colony. And you see the mortality. These two islands do not have BCG vaccination programs. So again, I think this pattern keeps repeating that when you reduce or when you do not have BCG vaccination, even if the number of cases was low, the mortality is very high. So I just would like, I saw this illustration in the New York Times and I loved it because it tells us how these pandemics move. When we look at the data per country as a whole, we lose a lot of information and time and space are very important to understand pandemics. So this is what the pandemic looked like in April, okay, 1 month. And again, is what I just showed you before, the entry of the pandemic in the main airports. Then this spread and new cases appear in the Midwest. The number of the entry cities began to decline. They further reduced. But then look at this. I want you to look carefully at what happened between here. This is between June and July, right? Things went crazy in the South. And this is how things looked, right? When the first peak took place, this is the New York suburbs, Georgia, Atlanta, and Louisiana, New Orleans were the focus of the infections. And now that we're going, and I want this line for you to compare the East Coast, all the East Coast of the US, and this line to separate what happened in the North and what happened in the South. So above this line, this is where the epicenter was, where things were terrible in April, May. Now, in this case, there's been a concerted effort to have containment measurements. Use of masks in public spaces is mandatory. Schools were closed at the right time. You know, social distancing has been accepted. In the South, there has been pressure to reopen the economy, although these states were not ready to reopen. And they did so. So now we're having a spike in cases. In July 1st, this was 49,000. Now we have reached 65 to 70,000 cases per day. That has, the number that we're saying is like 2,600 new cases per hour. And of course, I mean, this has an enormous case. This is an example of what happened in New York. There was a big increase initially. Then the measures came in, they declined, and you see the number of deaths now are less than 20. There are a few cases where there have been no deaths, and they are reopening the economy, but step by step and following. And as soon as cases begin to increase, they back off and go back to putting stronger measurements. Look at Texas, right? They were doing great, but at some point in the summer, in June, people say, okay, we did what we needed to do, we're done. People got tired, they went to the beach and they stopped using masks. And this became, it's a tragedy that this became politicized. To give you an example, the mayor of Atlanta wanted to make it mandatory to use face masks because their hospital system is at the limit of capacity. They don't have any more intensive care beds to treat people. The governor of the state sued him because he cannot make it mandatory for people to use masks. So when there is such political disagreement, it is tragic because we are, these political decisions that are, don't make any sense, are having a tremendous effect on people's health. And at the beginning in June, people say, oh, there's a lot of cases, but you see, no one is dying. Look at now what is happening. 3 weeks later, as we know, the deaths are climbing. Now the hospitals are full, and the disagreement continues. So I think one of the big tragedies, I think, of this pandemic, it has uncovered how politics can really have a devastating effect on the population. And this is Brazil. Brazil, to some extent, has stabilized, still has a lot of cases per death, 40,000, and about, I would say, 1,200 deaths per day. In some cities, the cases seem to be declining. Now in Rio, I look at the last few days, this is from the 18th, the cases went back up as if this is going in bursts. Maybe, I'm not sure what that means, if it is when the pandemic goes into certain neighborhoods of high density. I like to think of this pandemic like a fire, and when it finds an area where there's a lot of people that can be infected, it accelerates, and then when these so pockets of the population have saturated, then the cases go down. I saw that in Manaus, the cases have gone down. I checked yesterday, and Marcos da Cerda was telling me too. So I think that is very interesting, the dynamic. And I think the question that we have is, can the BCG be useful? At least in Guatemala, we're having many deaths of medical doctors and medical personnel. Are those deaths inevitable? Or could we prepare the immune system of these health workers ahead of time by giving a BCG vaccination, especially in those that are most susceptible? And I would like to finish just by showing you where is Brazil. This is the calculation I did for Brazil. According to what I could find in the internet, Brazil initiated the BCG vaccination in 1967. So they've been vaccinated for 53 years. The coverture was of about 63% during the first years, and then went up to 89%. As an average, is 78% of the population was vaccinated. If we do the Bcg Index calculation for Brazil, we get a 0.389. That means that if we use the European model, the BCG vaccination may be reducing the mortality in Brazil by at least by 40%, about 40%. And also Brazil has one advantage, and that is our developing countries, that we have a lot of young population, and young people get milder disease, so the mortality is low in younger countries. Now in Brazil, I would like to point out who are the vulnerable groups. Those more than 53 years old, according to the data, historical data, are not vaccinated. And those between 30 and 52 have less coverage. About 37% of the population in those age groups are not vaccinated. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for your attention. And if you have questions or comments, I'll be happy to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Thank you, Carolina, for the really nice talk. Very, very, very intriguing. And we have a lot of questions here. And I would like just to give a comment about the, what do you think that is the difference between the vaccination about all the older and younger people? Because if you think that is a training immunity, it's hard to think that we have different kind of scales, like in the babies or in the young adults.
Yes, I think that, or one idea is, okay, so it seems like when you vaccinate infants, the effect you're having is long lasting. To me, it's remarkable that a single vaccine when you were in the first month of age can protect you when you're 20, 30 years old, right? This will say that vaccination and that window may have a very important effect. That's one. But the other one is that there's some studies that are ongoing, and I have heard the preliminary results where they are using BCG in the elderly. This is broad, right? They vaccinate older people, 80 and older. And those that receive the BCG have much less respiratory infections, mostly viral infections, and less pneumonia. So it seems like vaccination in older people can help, but the duration of this effect may be shorter. It's not going to last 20 years. It may last 6 months, a year, but this could give us a bridge until the real vaccine comes, right? So the question is, you know, I gave a talk in Guatemala, and I'm a little bit worried because now all my family is going to get vaccinated with BCG this week. And I say, but you know, I'm not saying that it's proven, right? But what are the options we have, right? Is just wait for another year. It's going to take at least 1 more year to get that vaccine, I think. At least in the US, they say at least 6 more months when they start. Now, in Latin America, depending on the country, how quickly is this going to come? And until then, if you are in the unvaccinated group, should one be vaccinated or not? I think the answer, the idea would be to do a clinical study, especially in hospitals or places where people that are highly exposed, and vaccinate a segment of that population and see what is the effect. I would think you can measure 2 things. You can measure outcome, how many of them get severe COVID, how many of them have to be hospitalized, how many of them lose days of work because they're of illness, of COVID illness. And the other one, I'm very intrigued when people do the COVID testing, they give the result positive or negative, but they did it with quantitative PCR. They know the viral load. So does the BCG vaccination decrease the viral load? Because you may be positive, but you may get a milder infection. And if you control the infection better since the beginning, the prognosis is much better.
Good, thank you. There are a lot of really great talk, excellent. So we have now the first question from Keolis. Other pathogens may also train the immunity, not only exposure to BCG?
Yes, there are some reports that measles vaccinations could have an effect. There's one report that when they introduced the polio vaccine in Russia, there was an effect. What they have in common, they are all live organism vaccines. So they're not recombinant proteins, but they have to be live organisms. Basically, the body has to be sensing a real infection for this to be triggered. Now, when I review the literature, the evidence for BCG and the lung is very strong, much stronger than the other ones. Also, it's one of the few vaccines where you can do the epidemiological testing because the BCG has been eradicated in some countries, so they're no longer vaccinating with BCG. With measles or polio, we're still vaccinating everywhere. So you cannot really do an epidemiological study because everywhere these vaccines are still being applied. So there's no negative control, let's say, or non-vaccinated. Right? So this analysis, and also my impression is that these, all the effects of BCG, that most of them are in the lung, even with the elderly, they reduce pneumonias, which is one of the main causes of death in the elderly. It seems to me that it may be for the lung, it may be because mycobacterium, I think, has some tropism for the lung. When you get tuberculosis, it's a lung disease, right? So I think this organism may have something, some interaction with the lung. So that could be directing the immunity towards this organ. I don't know, for other organs, maybe, or for other types of infections, maybe an oral polio vaccine may be better in enhancing immunity to other infections. But I think that we decided to analyze BCG because by far is the one with the strongest effect in the lung that has been documented with the most studies. And it's also one where we can have countries all the way from 0 vaccination to 75 years of uninterrupted vaccination. So we have the extremes, and then we can measure the differences.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, no, because I think it's a kind of base in the kind of cytokines and chemokines that could be produced by these innate cells, training innate cells, that if it's in the early of the infection could be really useful, but if you think that about in the late phase of the infection, it will be not so good, no? I imagine, because you have this cytokine storm.
Yes, but the idea is that we don't know what triggers a cytokine storm, but it seems like what the data would say is that if you have had this vaccine, you're directing the immune system into the right place. Also, if you control the infection early on, you don't need to trigger all these other responses, right? Also, there's some studies in Belgium saying that those people that are asymptomatic, what they have is very strong cellular immunity against COVID. So we are not, the natural infection is not clear if it's antibodies what is protecting you, but it might be cellular immunity, and then the ability of the innate immune system to direct the antibody response. Should it be inflammatory or anti-inflammatory? Should be cellular or antibody mediated? So this decision early on, taking the right direction, and this is going to be directed by the innate immune system, is critical. If you give the wrong kind of response, then you go into inflammatory cytokine production and an immune response that is ineffective. They have found that the people with severe COVID are the ones that have the highest antibody levels and the highest affinity binding, probably because they have had the viral infections for longer. So there's been time for the cells to mature, the B cells to mature, and to evolve into higher binding antibodies. So I think it's a fascinating story.
From Mittermeier, that he said that all these kind of mechanisms and facts that you show, this could be due to a permanent exposition to endemic coronavirus in poor areas.
We do not know. So far, what I have heard is that there is no evidence that there is cross-protection. They have taken antibodies to people that have had antibodies to other coronaviruses, and they do not block COVID-19. Coronavirus, the whole name, SARS-CoV-2, I think is the other name. So the current pandemic coronavirus is not blocked by antibodies from other coronaviruses. So it's not clear if infection with one coronavirus protects you from others. Now, in areas of poverty, where there is a lot of high density and hygiene is not ideal, there could be other microbes for sure that are giving some protection. You may also have natural exposures to tuberculosis, because these are still endemic countries for tuberculosis. So there could be other organisms in these slums, let's say, that could also be conferring protection. I'm not saying that is only BCG. There could be other factors for sure.
Pablo, Dr. Carolina, how did you control for different reporting rates that affect particularly the poor countries, which by your data enforce more extensive BCG vaccination?
So, sorry, the first part, I missed the first part.
Okay. How did you control for different reporting rates that affect particularly the poorer countries, which by your data enforce more extensive BCG vaccination?
Yes, this is exactly what I explained, why we did not use all the analysis in the first part. We use mortality per million. We did not use cases, because the cases, as I showed later on with the % positive test, they are underreporting. The poor countries are not doing so much testing, so they're underreporting the cases. That's why we did not use for our analysis mortality. Also, this is the reason why for the Bcg index, the strongest data are from Europe, because we use socially similar countries in Europe, and we remove all these variables, and we took only mortality that is very accurately reported, right? So yes, this is very important. You cannot use the raw data on number of cases, because depending on the amount of testing, this number, as I showed, can be underreported.
And after we have from Camila, perhaps Brazil versus USA, will give us a definitive marker, as these are the two countries where COVID-19 is still raging.
Yes, I think that it would be great. I think Brazil would be a perfect place to do a clinical trial of this type. Trying to see, I think one could see what is the severity of the infection. And I would focus on those 40 and older, because that's the population that has high risk of severe COVID and the one that is not vaccinated, according to the data we can find in the historical data that are found in the internet. There's a website called Bcg Atlas that has the history of most countries. And other than that, it's very hard to find precise information for Brazil, but our understanding is that those 53 and older are not vaccinating at all, and those between 40 and 53 have low, at least 40% are not vaccinated. So I think that this would be the target population, and a more sensitive measure will be of those that do get infected, what is the viral load that they are managing? Because you would imagine that if they control the infection better, even if you test positive, you have less virus in your nose if you are controlling the infection. So you never reach super high levels of virus. That would be one prediction.
But as you said, for instance, the older population also can get contact with the tuberculosis infections independent of BCG vaccination. So it could be also a kind of confounding parameter.
Yes, it depends on the, you cannot separate these two variables.
Yeah.
That's why the cause effect needs to be demonstrated. The vaccinated BCG and those that received the BCG recently have a much better outcome. That is the proof, right? So I think, and like any epidemiological study, all epidemiology can give you is an association. Tells you an important biological response here. We can detect it at a large scale. It appears to be having there's a big impact at a population level, but is there a cause effect? Is the BCG the cause directly of this? And the reason why I tend to think is that this may be the case is that places like Finland, like Norway, have very low TB cases, but they have strong BCG and they have very good outcomes, very low mortality from COVID, although they almost don't have TB. Some countries have even stopped the vaccination, but only 5 years ago, and they still have very strong protection. And there's no TB in this country. So I think, in my view, that's why we center the key analysis with Bcg Index in Europe, because the quality of the data are more trustworthy. I think the reports are more trustworthy. I think you cannot hide 30,000 deaths in Europe. I mean, you can't hide that.
There is, again, vaccination of older people may not be protected if you consider the results obtained in England.
Yes, they will not be protected for a long time, right? I think that imagine what we're asking. We're saying that by vaccinating an infant, we're going to protect a person for several decades after that. I mean, for vaccine that is not to a virus, this is unheard of. Some viral vaccines give lifetime protection, but for non-viruses, this is unusual. So I don't think we can expect that giving a single vaccine for an adult will protect them for decades. I don't think that is going to happen. But can it protect them for a year or 6 months? And by time until the COVID vaccine comes? Should we do nothing? Or could we give BCG to this age group, have a pandemic, but without hospitalizations, without death? Is this possible?
I think it was the idea of Netherlands and Australia in that this kind of clinical trial using BCG, trying to wait for the real vaccine, for COVID. So you can do something and try to decrease the mortality by COVID.
Yeah, I was very excited about these studies, but when I saw the cases, I talked to a person doing this study and they have no more cases.
I thought that too. So, even in Australia,
So these results are never going to come. So are we just going to say we cannot do anything, or can Latin America put on a study? Come on, guys, it's Brazil. Clinical study. Marcus or anyone who is there. Clinical study. Vaccinate half, the other half not vaccinated. Is the outcome better? Is the viral load less? So can we do nothing, or can we put a clinical study together in Brazil? It's the place to do it.
So, Julia, ask to you, do you think it's possible to associate lower incidence of COVID-19 in children with the fact that BCG is still protecting them, considering that the trained immunity is also time associated and may not have a huge influence in adults?
Yes. I think that in general, this is a little bit hard to answer because even in the US, right, the morbidity of COVID is low. Children tend to get mild infections if they get infected. A few of them get this Kawasaki-like autoimmune transient immune system, immune response, this inflammatory response with Kawasaki. But most of them, the big majority, do well. Now, I do think that there's a study from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And they did a similar study to ours, but they used a different statistical analysis. And then they come to the same conclusions. And what they found is that this effect on reducing the mortality is stronger in countries that have at least 15 years of vaccination. It appears that having those that are, in the first decades, that's where they can measure the strongest effect at a whole population level. So one idea is that this would suggest that one can imagine that young people, if they're vaccinated, they are not only asymptomatic, but they may have lower viral loads. So you may get transmission, but transmission of lower levels of viruses. And this may result in infections that even if an older person gets them, they may be able to handle them a little bit better than if you get 100 times more virus when you're exposed, right? So there could be indirect effects at a population level, but this study from Israel says that the first decades, let's say the first 20 years after vaccination, are very important. They can measure the strongest effects. So if you vaccinate at least for the last 20 years, you begin to see, this is 55 countries they analyze, you already can measure a strong effect on COVID mortality. Also, I think this is one confounding factor there is the age, right? That there are many more people in these decades of age in young countries, right? So having the young vaccinated is important because they are the majority of the population. And if they have lower viral loads, they're less likely to transmit, or if they transmit, they may transmit a little bit milder infection because the initial dose is very important.
Okay, good. So now we have a lot of compliments, very great talk, and you are really, really smart. And BCG vaccination coverage varied widely in time and considering different states. I think at least refers to Brazil. So, yeah.
I was not able to find refined data, but this is something that you, I imagine, can find out, right? What are the vaccination rates? In my family, everybody was checking, am I vaccinating or not? One initial, if you have a scar on your left shoulder, you have been vaccinated because that's where they put, and that's where this vaccine leaves a mark. Not everybody gets the mark. You could be vaccinated and not have a scar, but if you have the scar, you were vaccinated. At least you received one dose at some point in your life. But this varies widely. And again, what I showed was an epidemiological analysis at a broad scale, but then we go into the micro scale in a given city. Who is the target population that is not vaccinated? And the individual people, who are the segment of the population we need to protect, and what is the age of those that are dying, right? I think it's precisely those that are in the age group that is not vaccinated.
Good. So another question from Teolis is exposure to environment bacteria could also affect traded immunity elicited by BCG.
I think that there is always an interaction between the lung microbiota and the maturation of the immune system, and these are complex interactions. I think we know very little about how I think there is compelling evidence that the initial microbiota of the lung is very important for maturation of the immune system, right, in general. Now, precisely how this affects maturation and the long-term effect of this initial microbiota, I think we still don't know, but there is something about, the immune system is not a passive system. The normal microbiota sends signals that help the immune system mature in the proper direction. I was talking to Jasmine Belcade, who's an immunologist, and she was telling me that maybe exposure to tuberculosis is something that was widespread in human populations for many years. And this may have been something that normally was in the environment and we mature with it. As we eliminate these, we may be lacking some of the signals to mature part of the immune system properly or to direct the immune system in the right direction. And again, I think that there is a trend, independent of COVID, there is evidence that vaccinating the elderly reduces the risk of them having pneumonia, independent of COVID, right? And these viral pneumonias decrease when you vaccinate the elderly. There's one published paper, and there is some data I have seen that I cannot describe in detail, but they're confidential, but the data look very strong. That you can vaccinate the elderly, it's safe, and they have less cases of pneumonia. This is what this study, it's about to come out, so I cannot give more details.
Patricia Veras, fantastic. Caroline, many thanks. In Brazil, tests are done in heterogeneously way, as well as annotation of test results, but can explain variations when looking results at the same week. So the number of tests that you show.
Yes, there's a lot of fluctuations everywhere. And what they do the 7-day average to remove all these noise, because depending on how the ministry in the different parts of the government work, they deposit the data in different dates, and all the Mondays there's more data than the weekend because it's closed. But I think what people do is we look at 7-day averages, right? So that we smooth that line and we can get a better idea of what we are doing.
Juliana Fulan, excellent presentation. Thank you, Carolina. Congratulations, amazing lecture from Alan. Thais Barbosa, amazing, excellent talk. Peter Maia, excellent talk. I think he started a question, but didn't finish. Marilda, congratulations, Caroline. That was a wonderful talk, a very exciting project. Ayana BCG, Sergio, Ayana BCG revaccinated. That is a good deal?
Yes, I would say so. If I could get the visit personally, now, I am not recommending that you go and vaccinate yourself. I think it's a personal decision. I provide the information and then every adult has to decide what they want to do. But I think it would be great if we could do a study to get the data and really give a clear answer. Does BCG vaccination, can BCG vaccination decrease the number of people that need to be hospitalized? And very important, some die, but there's a lot of people that got severe COVID that they recover, but they have long-term damage. There's a study in Spain that says that 50% of those with severe COVID have chronic, permanent cognitive damage. Other people are left with constant use of oxygen for the rest of their life because their lungs are destroyed. So the cost is enormous in this age group, 40 and older. So is there anything we can do for this group, or can we just wait and let for this pandemic and have this Russian roulette that if you're lucky, you do well, and if you're not, nothing happens? Can we intervene? And how can we know if we should intervene or not? We need to do a study. I think it's urgent to do a study. Now, the problem is the countries where we have a lot of cases, not all of them have the infrastructure. Brazil is the exception. You have the cases, you have the human capacity, and you have the infrastructure. I think Brazil is one of the countries that could lead and will have an enormous impact in all of the developing world to see how to face this. And is this part of the solution?
Patricia asked you, does a specific vaccination can trigger a more vigorous response than people previously vaccinated with BCG versus unvaccinated ones?
We do not know the details of, because there is very little known about this enhanced immune surveillance, but one would imagine that a second vaccination could enhance the response. I would refer to, there are some studies in which they have used BCG vaccine to try to treat people that have autoimmune disease. This is a very interesting concept, it's controversial. But in some of these studies, they find that if they give people one BCG vaccine a year for 3 years in a row, after the third year, their glycemias go down and they improve a lot. These are people with type 1 diabetes. There's a big clinical study for fibromyalgia, where they're also doing the same thing. So it seems like repeated exposure to BCG directs the immune system into a different, reprograms the immune system. In this case, it stores a less antibody-mediated immunity, like it directs it in a different direction. And some people believe that it's really working, other ones are skeptical. But I think that this is a very new field. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to understand it's not cellular immunity, it's not antibody and B-cell mediated immunity, it's innate immunity and immune surveillance. And it's organ specific, and time and space are critical to understand the systems. At least that's our experience in mosquitoes. You really need to know who, where, and when, and epithelial cells are also key players in immunity. We tend to think of just, monocytes and surveillance, but the epithelial cells are detecting, are talking, and are sending signals to the immune system. So time and space is going to be critical to understand this. Mm-hmm. I think in mosquitoes, we understand a little bit better what's going on, but nobody cares, right?
Yeah, it's easier. At least they are really smaller, and the immune system is not so complicated like us.
Yeah.
But how, as to great talk, Caroline, a correction for effectiveness of the surveillance system was introduced in the model?
Sorry, I didn't understand the first part.
A correction for effectiveness of the surveillance system was introduced in the model?
The surveillance system, meaning, again, like the cases reported, is that
I think so, yeah. But how? Do you want to talk?
No, it's about, like the percentage of positive tests that show that we're going to looking for contacts or not in the surveillance system.
Yes, so this is the reason, because we do not trust the surveillance of most countries, that we did not use number of cases in our analysis. We use mortality in the first month of the pandemic, or the first 25 days of the pandemic. This is the time where the measures have not come in. So you can, the political decisions will not affect this number as much. And also the reports of deaths, we think it's more accurate than the reports of cases. Right, so the last part I show you is just to illustrate, when I show the percent of positive tests, and this is just to illustrate how different they are, the level of surveillance, that some people have 0.9% positive, and other ones have 45, 50% positive tests. So that gives you an idea that different countries are not doing the same level of surveillance, and then we cannot use the number of cases that are reported because they're not accurate.
Okay. Well, I got that, but the idea was that if it's possible to include this percentage of positive tests as in part of the model prediction or evaluation.
Yes, the truth is that, yes, I was thinking that one could do a correction factor, right? One could say, okay, anyone that has more than 10% positive, we're going to correct. If you have 40%, you have 4 times more than what you reported, right? One could do a broad correction. But the truth is that at this point, I'm a mosquito person, and this is not my field. So I am inviting everybody and those that can do this to move further, right? I was just illustrating how one can manage the data. I think it could be possible to use the percent positive test to correct the real number of cases corrected, and then calculate the real predicted mortality per country, corrected mortality. And I do think that the differences will be even more striking, in the sense that it seems like countries where there's strong BCG, I think the mortalities are going to be below 1%.
Okay, thank you.
This is the question of Peter Meyer, that he and Mauricio Barreto, we showed that BCG protect against hookworms infection. I am glad to be vaccinated with BCG. Excellent talk, Julia. Patricia comments about the 7 days average is indeed a better way to check the results, what you said. Alan Oliveira say, getting vaccinated at either age will probably be less effective than it would be in children, but it is much better than using hydroxychloroquine, older age. Would probably, hydroxychloroquine is shown that doesn't work at all. So it's better to get vaccinated, and the side effects are really less than. Okay, I think excellent presentation. And Marcos Lacerda say a comentário here, but but there is nothing. Possibly he will talk with you.
Would you like to talk?
Afterwards.
Maybe Marcos.
Do you want to talk?
I would just like to make a comment if possible.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay, Carolina, great talk. Thanks for this. I have been following a lot all those discussions, not only on antiviral treatment, which I truly disagree, especially now, but of course I believe that immunity plays a major role, and that might explain the differences in many countries and continents. I think that vaccination was certainly a first approach, considering that not many children are infected and the lethality seems to be very low. So it makes a lot of sense to have vaccines as a good way of protection. As I told you earlier, there is a big Gates Foundation funded trial. It's already ongoing, and there are many Brazilian sites. I have made the bridge between you and Julio Croda, which is the person involved in that trial in Brazil. I totally agree that we should have moved faster, because the more we go for those highly endemic areas, and we are not able in Brazil to get all the regulatory agencies approving projects in time. So I myself have started many trials in Manaus. I have finished a couple of them, but most of the others I could not enroll patients. So that's key to get the right answer, to plan in advance places which are not facing the peak of the disease. And I think that now the central part of Brazil and the south are those with more promising sites, because they haven't reached the peak. But I definitely agree that this immunological training might play a good role. And congratulations for the talk again.
Thank you very much. And I think, if I understand correctly, Brazil produces its own BCG, I think. So it's even something that, BCG is not an expensive vaccine. It's relatively...
Exactly. It's very inexpensive, and it's used in the first 2 weeks in the newborn. So it's universally used in Brazil.
Okay, I think it's done. Thank you very much, Carolina, for accepting our invitation. It was really a pleasure, great talk. And hopefully the next time you can come here and try to spend some time with us discussing, who knows, the BCG vaccine and all these possible clinical trials here and US.
Thank you. I would love to be back in Brazil. I feel very close to all of you. It's always a pleasure, and thank you very much for the invitation. And let's hope that we can meet soon and in person.
Okay. Thank you very much, guys.
Bye-bye.
See you in the next Friday. See you. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.